Welcome to the Galloway Show on YouTube. Raw and unvarnished, although looking rather more polished than last week. Our first episode attracted 55,000 viewers, and I feel somehow that there are going to be a larger number tuning in now or later to this show. A funny thing happened to me on the way to the studio about 4 o'clock this afternoon. Well, I say studio, but actually I'm in my front room. And actually, my wife, my grandson, and his partner and my friend actually in Manchester are the only people involved in this broadcast. And none of us are being paid. I make that point because you'll see a PayPal ad coming up along the bottom of the screen throughout the show. That's not for this show, which costs absolutely nothing to me or to you. It's to raise funds to keep the mother of all talk shows going on Sunday nights. We launched that last Sunday and it's been a splendid success, completely paid for the whole show, which is a full shebang, a full proper camera people and so on. But this show is raw and unvarnished, just one camera, my family and me. So just like last week, after an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer this week because there's so much to talk about, I'll be doing an after hours on my Patreon page. That's when I take my jacket off and get a bit more intimate with the people who are watching. So if you want to join me for that intimate chat on Patreon, please subscribe. Patreon.com/George Galloway. Now, what was the funny thing that happened on my way to my front room studio? Well, about 4 o'clock this afternoon, I saw on Twitter, though they did not inform me, neither by email nor by direct mail, that I had suddenly been stamped as Russian state-affiliated media. I've gone all these years without such a designation, even when I did present shows on RT and Sputnik. Now that I can't, indeed it would be a criminal offense for me so to do, present anything on Russian state-affiliated media, Twitter, under the new Elon Musk era, has decided to give me that stamp, a kind of red star to put on my chest. And I won't accept it because it isn't true. I have now no affiliation whatsoever with Russian state media or any Russian media for that matter. The British government, in the name of free speech, made sure of that. So it's a trifle Kafkaesque, Mr. Elon Musk, that all the years I did present on RT and Sputnik, you never designated me Russian state media. And now that I do not present anything on RT or Sputnik, you've decided to designate me. I don't know how to account for this change of policy on the part of Twitter or the timing, although it did happen on the same day that I crossed the threshold of 400,000 followers on Twitter. I may say it's since 4 o'clock this afternoon, it's now 405,000 and climbing. And my tweet to Twitter protesting this grotesque, ridiculous decision of theirs now has 2.5 million impressions on Twitter. So if the purpose of this move was to somehow turn people away from what it is I have to say, what I stand for, what I believe, both generally and specifically about today's events, that clearly hasn't worked yet. It may very well be that algorithmically I'll be slowly strangled from now on if I can't get this mark of Cain, as they plainly see it, removed from my forehead. It might be even that I end up like poor Scott Ritter, whose military commentary on the war between NATO and Russia being fought out in Ukraine and be taken off the platform altogether. That's why I say, and I have been saying it now for a couple of months, it's vital that you follow me on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, because in a way, that's my last redoubt. That's the last place that you'll be able to find me on social media, because it's perfectly possible that despite having literally now millions of followers across these social media platforms, I can be non-personed on a whim, on a corporate whim. Now, this is particularly disappointing, as many of us, me included, thought that Elon Musk coming to power in Twitter would be the beginning of a brand new day. After all, he described Twitter as the public square. And then he said that the principles of free speech must be in practice, in play, in the public square. Well, of course, they haven't stopped me from speaking, but they've put a brand on me that is presumably designed to make people think twice about reading me, make people think twice about believing me, and it's entirely false. So I have put the matter in the hands of my lawyers, the redoubtable Kevin Winter of KRW Human Rights Law in Ireland, and we will seek by any means possible to have this false designation removed. And I hope if Elon Musk ever hears about this, he'll see it as an egregious overreach by whoever is in charge of applying these labels. I hope so, anyway. Now, I want to talk mainly about Pakistan and about the war taking place in Ukraine. But I want to start with something that caught my eye yesterday, and chances are you may not have heard about it. Amongst the more than half the countries in the world against which the United States government is applying economic sanctions, a new country appeared on the list. That country was little Cambodia. Cambodia is being sanctioned by the United States because of the closeness of its relations with China. Imagine. Cambodia, which was so frenetically bombed illegally by the United States government in the 1970s, the government of Richard Nixon lied to Congress about the bombing of Cambodia. More bombs were dropped on Cambodia than were dropped in the entire Second World War. And such was the carnage and devastation visited upon little Cambodia that a regime called the Khmer Rouge and their killing fields came to power in the ashes. The Khmer Rouge, in their killing fields, committed genocide. The film by the same name, Killing Fields, became, I think, an Oscar winner in the days before you could punch people live on television at the Oscar award ceremonies. Cambodia and its Khmer Rouge genocidal government nevertheless kept the support of both the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher at the United Nations for many years after the government was toppled and the Vietnamese army moved in, because the genocide had begun to spill over the border into Vietnam. Just think about that. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan voted annually to allow the Khmer Rouge ambassador to retain his seat at the United Nations, even though the Khmer Rouge government had long been driven from power. Can you believe that? Well, I spent several weeks in Cambodia as a member of the British parliamentary delegation, indeed the leader of the British parliamentary delegation to Cambodia for the presidential election in, I think, 1999. I was there working in joint harness with a man called Mr. Chatterjee, who was the chief executive of the Parliament of India at the time. He and I became acutely aware, whilst being debriefed in the evening times about what we had found during that day's election campaigning, we became acutely aware that there was a regime change operation going on here, and many of the parliamentary delegates that were there as election observers were in fact involved in a covert regime change operation to try and ensure that the president, Hun Sen was his name, who was thought to be rather too pro-Vietnamese, would not actually succeed in the election. And Mr. Chatterjee and I, he having had no dog in the fight at all, but merely a parliamentary professional, had to get into nightly dogfights with European parliamentarians who were doing everything that they could to discredit, distort, and if possible, change the outcome of that election. They failed. Hun Sen was comfortably elected, and elected again, and I think elected again. So not every regime change operation mounted by the West succeeds. They have not been able to make little Cambodia bow to the empire. Cambodia retains its sovereign right to have relations with China at any degree of warmness it chooses. And so the United States, a country which bombed Cambodia so secretly, illegally, and murderously for so many years, has now added Cambodia to the list of international baddies that have to be economically punished. Now, that's all a prelude to a segue into the situation in Pakistan. As I said at some length, and this has now been viral across Pakistan and elsewhere in the world with literally millions of views, what is going on in Pakistan is another regime change operation. It's not that I'm a supporter of Imran Khan. I like him. He's a friend of mine. I respect him, but I've never been a supporter of him or his party. In fact, quite the opposite. I spent decades at the site of the then People's Party leader, the late Benazir Bhutto. I don't get involved in internal Pakistani politics, at least not where I can help it. And I'm not getting involved in internal Pakistani politics here, because the attempt to get rid of Imran Khan is not a local or a domestic matter. It's a regime change operation mounted by the United States of America, not because he's good or he's bad on economic policy or social policy, or he keeps the lights on, or the trains running on time, or the roads being properly passable and repaired. None of that. It's nothing to do with Imran Khan's domestic performance as the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He's being regime changed because, in addition to the historic and traditional close relations which Pakistan maintains with the People's Republic of China, Imran Khan has committed the cardinal sin of negotiating for his own people at very competitive rates an endless supply of Russian gas and Russian wheat. And that's something up with which the United States will not put, at least if it can help it. So the double whammy of a Prime Minister of Pakistan having good relations with both Russia and China and refusing, just like the Indian government next door, to sanction Russia was basically the kiss of death for the Imran Khan administration, because the United States thought that all it had to do was send a letter. Imagine, a letter. They don't even do these things with a whisper in the ear anymore. Send a letter to the leaders of the opposition in Pakistan, explicitly stating that relations with the United States will not improve as long as Imran Khan remains in power, and will only improve if another prime minister is installed in his place. And like Pavlov's dogs, the leaders of the opposition parties in Pakistan immediately set to work to try and bring the government down with lavish use of bribery and corruption to make people turn their coat. Pakistani politics is famous for turncoats. There's a whole lot of lota goes on in Pakistan, and this one was the most handsomely rewarded of all. People received massive bribes. Who knows where the money came from? Either the United States or, more likely, one of its satrapies in the Gulf. But they bought enough MPs to desert Imran Khan, to bring him down in a motion of no confidence. But the Speaker ruled that motion of no confidence out of order because it was the product of a foreign conspiracy, and immediately called for new parliamentary elections. What's wrong with that? Who's going to complain about new parliamentary elections? Only somebody that thinks they're going to lose them. Anybody who thought that they had a chance of winning them would not be complaining. And the reason that they're complaining is, if I'm any judge, and I'm a long hand at Pakistani politics, trust me on that, Imran Khan and his party will sweep the country, because the Pakistani people are a proud and dignified people. They don't want to be ruled from thousands of miles away by the United States of America, which cares nothing for them, which knows nothing of them, couldn't care less whether they have bread or don't, or gas or not, couldn't care less, is merely interested in the geostrategic, geopolitical stance of Pakistan as a neighbor of China and now an ally of Russia. Imran Khan has made the right call. The sun is rising in the east. Eurasia is the future, not old Europe or North America, as we are quickly finding out, and more on this in a minute when I turn to Russia and Ukraine. Pakistan has made the right call. The Prime Minister of Pakistan has made the right call, and I hope that he is rewarded at the ballot box for that. Unless, of course, somebody kills him. And that's happened before, of course. Pakistani leaders have been killed before. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the father of Benazir Bhutto, was judicially murdered before. And the hangman that murdered him was also killed in a bomb attack on his aircraft just a few years later, once his dirty work in Afghanistan had been done. So killing Pakistani leaders is no problem for the power and those that they work for. But even if not killed, the elections can, of course, be rigged. And elections in Pakistan are frequently rigged. They're rigged by the military and by the intelligence, who are clients of the United States of America. So these elections might be rigged. Imran Khan might be killed. But if neither of those things happen, I predict that Khan will sweep the country in a victorious election and another rejection of United States bullying, bribing, and browbeating. It's all going pear-shaped for the United States of America, and not just in India, not just in Pakistan. It's going pear-shaped in Europe. Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, have all joined the ruble gas affair. They have all said, and others are now openly contemplating doing so, that they cannot afford to do without Russian gas, and that it's not much of a price to pay, if you'll forgive the pun, that you pay a country for its exports in its own currency. What's wrong with that? Would the British refuse the idea that people should pay our exporters in pounds? Seriously, think about these things. Don't be like sheep led by donkeys. Think about these things. What they're demanding Russia does is accept foreign currency in exchange for its exports. How would Britain react if the United States told us that our exporters must be paid in dollars for our exports abroad? Of course, people would laugh at that. Yet that is precisely what is being demanded of Russia. And Russia has quite correctly said, no rubles, no gas. If you don't pay us in our own currency, which is now, by the way, pegged to the gold, and Russia has the world's largest store of gold, didn't know that, did you? Is now linked to the gold standard, then if you don't pay us in our own currency, then we're not going to sell you gas, oil, coal, wheat, neon, nickel, all the other raw materials that are vital for the manufacturing process in Europe and even in North America. Now, do you ever get the feeling you've been had? In the last week, Joe Biden's government has increased by 43% Russian oil exports to the United States of America, whilst threatening European countries that they should not be buying oil and gas from Russia. The US itself has increased by 43% in 1 week its own imports of Russian oil. Not only that, having threatened European countries that they must not buy anything from Russia because they're fueling the Russian military machine, they say, the United States quietly lifted its own sanctions on Russian fertilizer. Why? Because the US agriculture sector was suddenly faced with dramatic shortages of fertilizer, which would have gravely affected the harvest come the fall. And of course, the farm vote in the United States is exceedingly important. In many states that Joe Biden and his party have to face election in November. So, without telling anyone in Europe, the US lifted the sanctions on Russian fertilizer. How is that for hypocrisy? Anyway, turning to the war itself. You'll notice that I carefully referred to it as a NATO-Russia war, which is being fought out over the bodies of and over the territory of the Ukraine. That's all it is. It's plain for anyone with eyes to see that whilst Ukraine might not be in NATO, NATO sure is in Ukraine. It's got bases in Ukraine. It has sent tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment, including lethal military equipment, armaments, into Ukraine. Everyone knows that. I'm not stating anything but the bleeding obvious. But here's something you might not know. In Mariupol, the fortress of the Azov regiment, it's not a battalion as people keep calling it, it's a regiment of the Ukrainian army, a regiment that flies the swastika, wears the SS death head, goose steps and worships the Jew killer, Stepan Bandera. Its headquarters, its fortress, is in a town called Mariupol, or at least it was. The Azov regiment has been overwhelmingly destroyed by the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the armed forces of the two independent republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. But there's still holdouts in the metal factory in the outskirts of Mariupol. Something or someone important is hidden out amongst them. That must be true because no less than 3 helicopters have now been destroyed by surface-to-air missiles trying to rescue whoever is still in that factory. Foreign helicopters, French military helicopters. The French media has reported the loss of Secret Service operatives of the French Secret Service in one of those helicopters that was shot down over Mariupol. A boat, a foreign boat, was sunk off the coast of Mariupol, and all hands on it were lost. Foreign hands were lost. So who or what is it that is holed up in Mariupol that the international NATO powers are so desperate to rescue that they are ready to sacrifice their men and their expensive military assets in order to rescue? One can only wonder. But it is, I think, justifiable to speculate that the people they're trying to rescue are not the leaders of the Nazi regiment that goes by the name of Azov. That would be too embarrassing, wouldn't it? Just days before the French presidential elections, losing your men and your helicopters to rescue the leaders of a Nazi regiment? No, that would be foolish in the extreme, and even Macron isn't that much of a fool. So if it's not the leaders of the Azov regiment they're trying to rescue, who is it? Or what is it that they are so terrified falls into the hands of the Russian forces and independent republic forces that surround the industrial plant? It has to be NATO figures, doesn't it? Or it has to be important biowarfare assets that they are afraid of falling into Russian hands. Which is it? Is it a French general? Is it an American general? Is it a British general? Who? Maybe it's all three. It's certainly something NATO desperately wants to rescue. Not that you will have read any of this in the mainstream media in the United States or in the United Kingdom, or apart from in the death notices, which I read avidly every day, in France, in the French media. This is all being kept a secret from you. Now, if you are living in a democratic country, and I hope that you are, how content are you with the fact that a systematic Mccarthyite sweep is going on to eliminate or discredit any voice that might bring you uncomfortable truths, and simply refuses to report in the least photographed, least filmed war in history in 2022, when everyone's got a camera on their phone? How content are you to be a sheep led by that donkey Joe Biden. By the way, did you see the videos of him this week? How humiliating, how cringeworthy were those videos. Poor Joe Biden. It's elder abuse. You've got to ask yourself, are you content that your money and your men are being sacrificed in a secret war, the truth of which is being kept from you, and worse, much worse, lies are being spun to you as truth? And I therefore turn to the false flag operation in Bucha, B-U-C-H-A. Maybe it was chosen as the site of the false flag because many Western people think it's pronounced Butcha, which is a bit like butcher. And of course, it is their purpose to paint Russia and its president, Putin, as a butcher, the butcher of Bucha. Get it? Anyway, we have been told, boy, have we been told, in a tsunami of fake news, that Russian forces committed a massacre upon their departure from Bucha with the Russian withdrawal from Kiev, which the Russians say may not be true, by the way. The Russians say was a strategic withdrawal to improve the prospects of a negotiated peace. Not sure I entirely believe that, but that's their stance. One way or another, the Russians withdrew on the 30th of March from Bucha. We know that because on the 31st of March, the mayor of Bucha, beaming broadly from the steps of the town hall in Bucha, declared that the enemy had gone and that the town had been liberated by Ukrainian forces. It was a happy day. It was a liberation day. But oddly, he never mentioned that a massacre had been committed by the Russians on their way out. Neither did the two New York Times journalists who went there to celebrate the liberation of Bucha on the 31st of March. But on the 1st of April, the Azov battalion moved in to the town. We know that because they told us so in their bulletin. What was their purpose? Well, helpfully, they told us that also in their bulletin, that they were moving in to clean up saboteurs and collaborators from amongst the population of Bucha. Those saboteurs and collaborators could well be identified by the white armbands rather than the blue or yellow armbands tied around their arms. Dead bodies were indeed found, and they all had white armbands tied to their arm. They were all carrying, when they were murdered, supplies given to them by the withdrawing Russians. Strange then that the allegation was then made that the Russian forces, who had lived amongst these people for an entire month without any conflict between them, and a people amongst whom, according to the Azov, there were collaborators in significant numbers. Odd then that the Russians, for no purpose whatsoever, unless they wanted to draw NATO into the war, would massacre people on the way out. And then there were the videos of corpses which moved, corpses which even sat up straight once the camera had passed them, but who could be seen in the rear view mirror of the vehicle in which the camera was operating. Corpses being pulled by ropes into position, more photogenic position, in the street, nightmare street in Buka, where many dead bodies were then deposited. Deposited by whom is the question. Well, we'll all have our speculation on that. Here's mine. My speculation is that these people were murdered as collaborators by the fascists in the Ukrainian army, and that they were then arranged in a false flag operation to draw NATO into the war, depending, as they surely could, on the parade of blue tick liberals in the media and in the political class to increase the clamor for increased NATO involvement directly in the war. Cui bono is a question to be asked when confronted with any crime. Who benefits? Who benefited from a massacre in Buka? The Russians or the Ukrainian government in Kiev in its quest to get more money, more weapons, and if possible, more direct military involvement? My speculation is that these people were murdered as collaborators, and I cite the evidence that I gave earlier of the armbands and the food and other essential aid given by Russia to many of the people whose bodies were filmed and shown as apparent evidence of a war crime. But I don't know any of that to be true. It's speculation. It's as good as your speculation because you don't know either. You've just been told that you know by a media which has been politically cleansed in advance by our government and by other governments in the Western world. There's only one way to find out, isn't there? That's to set up a United Nations independent inquiry into this horrific affair, which one way or another led to the killing of a substantial number of people, whoever killed them. It's an affair so ghastly that it should be investigated, shouldn't it? By an independent inquiry put together by the United Nations, shouldn't it? Well, certainly that's what Russia asked for. It asked on Sunday night, when the story broke, it asked for an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council the very next day. Who refused to hold that emergency session? The British government, which temporarily holds the chairmanship of the United Nations Security Council. Suspicious, no? The people accused of a crime are demanding that it be immediately investigated, and the people who are doing the accusing say, no, not yet. We want to prolong the media operation around this issue for as long as possible, but they will not be able to prolong it for long. Important new scientific evidence has emerged which deals with shadows and light and the position of the sun over Buka on given days at the end of March and into the first week of April. I expect that Russia will adduce that evidence to discredit the narrative of this story that you have been told to believe. Believe it if you like. If you think that the governments that lied to you about Iraq, that lied to you about Libya, that lied to you about Syria, that lied to you about Brexit, that lied to you about Boris, that lied to you about Jeremy Corbyn, if they're suddenly telling the truth about Ukraine, well, that would indeed be a kind of miracle, a kind of Lazarus, the truth rising from the ground in which it had been laid for so long. How long have I been speaking? My goodness, 41 minutes already. Let me turn back to the issue that I raised first of all. I know a lot about Mccarthyism. You'll remember in my quite famous session at the United States Senate, I opened with the words of many of the accused in the McCarthyite witch hunts and the House Un-American Activities Committee. I opened with a paraphrase of the famous line, "Senator, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a communist." At the Senate, I used very similar words because I am something of an authority. On the Hollywood 10, you'd never get 10 now in Hollywood, standing up against the prevailing imperial narrative. You'd be lucky if you could get 2 to stand up against it now. I know a lot about Joe McCarthy. And what we're living in now is McCarthyism, with one important difference. The biggest supporters of the McCarthyism that we are living through are people who would have been on the receiving end of the witch hunts in the period of McCarthyism. The people most joyous at Scott Ritter being taken off Twitter today, most joyous about me being falsely labeled with the Russian state media affiliate branding, are blue ticks, are liberals, are progressives. Some of them even would call themselves socialists. The only person to call me today, the only one, was Lawrence Fox of the Reclaim Party, a libertarian, a political opposite of mine, but a man who believes in free speech. He phoned to commiserate, to say how dangerous the waters we now are in, but to arrange an interview that I'm going to do, a discussion I'm going to do with him on his platform tomorrow morning. I don't know when it will be aired. But you get my point. It's the people who think of themselves as liberals who have turned out to be the biggest cheerleaders for and supporters of tyranny, of the extirpation of the other point of view, of the virtual assassination of any political figure that disagrees with them. They called people wearing Donald Trump hats fascists. They called people that voted for Brexit fascists. But actually, the people who are supporting fascism are they. 3 times this week, people have called me Lord Haw Haw. But Lord Haw Haw was a supporter of the Nazis, not of the country that was destroying the Nazis then in the Second World War and now in Mariupol. It's you who call me Lord Ho-Ho, who are the people who are actually supporting Nazism in 2022, seeded throughout the Ukrainian military and civil society. My last point on that. The SS, Galicia Division, SS, which part of those initials do you not understand? Galicia Division, Ukrainian division of the SS, not 10 miles from here, from where I'm sitting, in my house. There's a Ukrainian prisoner of war camp from the Second World War and a church that they used to worship in. On a Sunday, they'd be let out of the camp under escort, armed escort, by British soldiers to go and worship in a church. It's there. It's a big sign on it. These were from the Galician SS, captured by British forces and held as prisoners of war. A new wave of commemoration in remembrance of the Galician SS has been authorized in the capital city of Kiev. I'm going to stop now and take some comments that have come in. George is very courageous as the West supports Nazis in Ukraine. Imagine his and our followers' fate should they ever reach England. It's a very good point. Of course, fascism industrially attempted to annihilate from the face of the earth every last Jew, every last gypsy, every last mentally and physically disabled person would have been annihilated if the Red Army had not stopped them in their tracks and liberated the camps. But it was not only these groups who were massacred in the death camps. It was people like me, people that support me. It was socialists like me, trade unionists like me, people who opposed Nazism of all kinds were rounded up and either summarily massacred on the spot or put into trains to the death camps where they were either worked to death and starved or were annihilated along with the 6 million Jews in the gas chambers themselves. Let me see if there are any more. Just New says, I hope the world will be at peace one day. We need to unite against US imperialism. Thank you for that, Just New, and thanks for the donation, which will go to keeping the mother of all talk shows alive on Sundays. Will we have peace? Not as long as we have the economic system that we have. War is ineluctably a part of the system of imperialism, which is itself ineluctably a part of the capitalist economic system that we operate. I firmly believe that there will never be an end to war until there is an end to the system of exploitation, of man by man, of poor country by rich country, and rivalries, even within the imperialist camp itself, some of which you're about to see become more acute, because Germany cannot sustain this NATO policy towards Russia. Germany is going to join Austria and Slovakia and Hungary and others and break with the Joe Biden imposed policy. And if it does not, well, it'll be regime changed. Let's take some more. Propaganda works best when those who are being manipulated believe they are acting on their own free will. That's from Jim Fixer, and it is, of course, attributed to Joseph Goebbels, the master of the propaganda, the bigger the lie, the more likely it is to be believed, and all of that. It's undoubtedly true, Jim, that it's easier to fool a man than it is to convince him that he has been fooled. That much Malcolm X said a long time ago, and that much is clearer to me now than it has ever been. It is much easier to fool a man than to convince him that he has been fooled. This is from Abel Malcolm, I think, or Abe Malcolm. It says, these are Julian Assange's words, quote, lies create wars, truth creates peace. The liars are in full control of the narrative. They are the entire mainstream media. It's a very good point, sir. And it's a very clear difference between now and 2003 and the invasion and occupation of Iraq. In the invasion and occupation of Iraq, although we had overwhelmingly broadcast media that supported the Bush and Blair war, the print media, which was more influential back then than it is now, was very much more mixed. The Daily Mail even was distinctly unpersuaded of the war on Iraq. Andrew Alexander, Hitchens himself, Peter Hitchens, and many other writers on the Mail were very skeptical indeed about the Iraq war. The Daily Mirror, then edited by Piers Morgan, who's completely lost the plot over this war, was not just an opponent of the Iraq war, but basically turned the Daily Mirror over to us in the leadership of the anti-war movement, and helped a great deal in the great demonstration on 15th February 2003, which drew 2 million people to Hyde Park. We have none of that today. The entire, as you put it, the entire mass media has been taken over, although willingly. I'm not suggesting the government forced them. No need to force them. In the old adage, thank God you cannot bribe or twist the average British journalist. But when you see what unbribed he'll do, you realize there's no reason to. Let me take some more. This is from Nomayor1 with a very kind donation of £20. Thanks for that. George, why does the EU say we are at war with Russia? I didn't know that they'd put it as bluntly as that. I mean, plainly they are at economic war with Russia, and plainly they are deeply implicated. And when we finally find out who it is they're trying to spring from the trap in Mariupol, we'll know perhaps even startlingly more how deeply they are involved in this war. But war is a two-way street. Even economic war is a two-way street. And the Western economies, particularly the European economy, but the United States economy is not going to escape at all unscathed from this. It's going to discover that they struggled mightily to lift that huge rock, only to drop it on their own feet. BCN Rebelde, another kind donation. Thank you. George, what do you think about Olaf Scholz as a person and as a leader? Well, I've never met him. I don't know him. I had thought that before he got into bed with the Green Party, who are the most rabidly warlike party in Germany and indeed in Australia and in many other parts of the world. There ain't much peaceful about the so-called Greens, I've got to tell you. But before he got into bed with them, I had some hopes that he would continue the pragmatic policy towards Russia that Angela Merkel did. But sadly, that has turned out not to be true. Scholz has taken Germany to the verge of bankruptcy and to the verge of war. As I put it this week, if Germany goes ahead and nationalizes the assets in Germany of Gazprom and other big, mighty Russian companies, that's tantamount, to an act of war. The expropriation of Russian property in Germany is tantamount to an act of war. So Schulz has taken Germany into a very dangerous place. Dangerous not just for Germany, but for the rest of us who have long memories about darker days in Germany. This is from Missy. Most Americans are fed up, but we don't have the megaphone. The radical left owns the media and social media. Our voices aren't heard, but in November, we'll put the radical left in Congress out of business. Well, Missy, the only thing I would demur about this is that I think you're confusing liberal with radical left. But what's in a name? If they are the radical left, I'm not radical left. I want nothing to do with these people. If you support NATO, if you support the EU, if you support Joe Biden, and if that's left, then I ain't left. I'm just a socialist. Don't call me left or right. I ain't left if that's what left is. But I agree with you, Missy. I do think that the Democrats are going to be thrashed in the elections in November. And furthermore, I very much hope that they are thrashed. Now, let's see. Claire Owens says Elon Musk did come out in support of Russell Brand, saying we need a wider range of views being heard, not just the mainstream media. He did, Claire, and he's made some very good statements. And just this morning, I was very happy that he is now the biggest single shareholder in Twitter. And then at 4 o'clock this afternoon, which of course has nothing to do with him personally, probably never even heard of me, although he probably does now after millions of impressions in this controversy. Thanks for that, Claire. Andrew Datman, is it? Thanks again, Andrew, for a kind donation. Only the illness paradigm offers a way out of the current standoff. I have prepared the spiritual diagnosis now for the last 7 years. See DRT, Dog Global /corporate. I don't know what that means, Andrew, but thanks for the donation anyway, and I read it out. Any others that I should turn to before I go after hours? Elena Stone. Europe's still confused who is harming them. Europe is being treated as sacrificial lambs and collateral damage to pursue US interests. You've put it better than I could, Elena. You're absolutely correct. Not only is the US ready to fight this war with Russia, down to the last drop of Ukrainian blood, it's ready to sacrifice every part of the European economy in order to confront Russia. Not just because Russia is seen by them as an existential enemy, but because the Russian-Chinese alliance is the biggest obstacle of all to continuing American hegemony in the world. China and Russia together with India and Iran and Brazil and South Africa and other countries who are not a part of this war drive are unbeatable. But it didn't have to be a zero-sum game. These countries could all have risen without us having to fall. Unfortunately, we've chosen to confront them rather than cooperate with them. We could all have benefited from that cooperation. Let's see any more. I've spoken for an hour, but I'm going to go on a few minutes. Kinja, a very handsome donation. Thank you for that. What's your thoughts on what the near future holds if all the real misinformation from the monopolistic media ends up being anything to go by? Well, I put it this way. Of course, the great majority of our people in Britain and in the United States, and I presume in European countries, has been fooled. I'd be a fool to deny that. But there is a larger number of switched on people than there has ever been at any time in human history. And I take great comfort from that. The fact that my following on social media is currently going up, not at 1,000 a day, but today 4 or 5,000 in a day, shows that there's a huge audience for the other point of view. And that's something I think they didn't count on. They didn't count on the fact that switched on people know how to find the alternative point of view, what I would describe as the truth. So don't despair. We're not beaten yet. Let's see if there's any more. Carol says, those corpses in Buka really need to learn to stop moving. Indeed, there were moving corpses, but there were also quite dead corpses who died in horrific circumstances, were murdered. There's no military or legal justification for the killing of these people. Whoever killed them murdered them and should stand trial for murdering them. The question is, who murdered them? For me, all the evidence points in the direction of the fascist elements of the Ukrainian military. But I support the Russian call for an urgent and fully empowered United Nations Security Council independent inquiry into it. That's the way to get to the truth, I think. Let's take more. L.W. Paradis says, there is much George Galloway says that I do not endorse one bit. But this lie about him has caused me to hit the like button and will contribute to his mother of all talk shows. Enough is enough. Thank you very much kindly for that. I don't ask people to endorse everything or even anything that I say. I'm asking people to endorse my right to say it. Because if they silence me, who will they silence next? Who have they silenced already? I mean, for goodness sake, Donald Trump was the president of the United States of America and he was silenced on social media. I mean, how do you even compute that? And it turns out, over Ukraine and Hunter Biden, Donald Trump was the one that was telling the truth. Biden and the Democrats and all of the mass media, including big tech, who were telling the lies. Let's see if there's any more. Sean B says, I'm waiting for the US to sanction themselves once they run out of people to sanction. There must be a big skyscraper somewhere in New York or in Washington where an entire department keeps track of all the countries, all the people, and all the things that are now sanctioned by the United States of America. More than half of the population of the planet live in countries currently being sanctioned by the United States of America. You couldn't make that up. Thanks for that comment. Take a few more. Tanya Keen says, the USA needs sanctions for bombing citizens of Vietnam with napalm. That was on TV and was horrific. Indeed so. It is astounding the ease with which the politicians, the media, the political class, but also, tragically, a very large section of the public not only has forgotten all the war crimes that our own countries have just recently been involved in, they have forgotten a war in Yemen that is actually taking place right now. You seen any Yemen flags anywhere? You seen any appeals for Yemen? Even when you're watching the Champions League, it comes up on your screen, an appeal for Ukraine. Did you see any appeals for the people of Gaza? The BBC refused even to broadcast the details of the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal for the people who had been bombed to smithereens in Gaza with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Did anybody wear Palestinian colors on their sleeves, hang them from their windows? It is astounding the aplomb with which journalists who know all these things don't make the mistake of thinking they're just fools. They're much worse than fools. But the aplomb with which they talk about war crimes. We've got Gordon Brown and Tony Blair demanding a war crimes tribunal for Vladimir Putin. George Bush demanding a war crimes tribunal for Vladimir Putin. When these men are responsible for millions of deaths. Not in the last century or the one before that, but in this century, just a few years ago. I must take more. Yassin Al-Muravid, thank you for the kind donation. Assalamu alaikum, George. Thank you for your service to the truth. My question is, when do you think the collapse of the US will happen? And how will that affect us in the long term? Well, it's a big subject that I have frequently dilated on and will again. I don't have time to do your wonderful question justice right now. So here's a short answer to it. In the 1960s, Chairman Mao, the Chinese leader, described American imperialism as a paper tiger. It wasn't true then, as the people of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and many, many other places were to find out. It wasn't true then. It was distinctly premature. It isn't even true now. The United States is far from a paper tiger. But here's the problem. It is an old tiger with many teeth that have fallen out. And there are newer, younger, fiercer tigers out there now in the jungle. And the old and faded tiger doesn't quite know how to handle this. Now, I said earlier, I would have handled it thus. I would have said, how wonderful, all you new powers that are rising. Let's share power in the world. Let's cooperate. Let's invest in each other's businesses. Let's trade with each other. Let's cooperate with each other. Let's ensure that we're all in a security architecture that threatens none of us and gives security to all of us. That's what I would have done and what I have advocated. And after Brexit, I thought that we might be able to get a Britain which could play that role, but not so far, not under the current management. So the question, the big question is, will the United States prefer to destroy the world in a world nuclear war rather than give up its unipolar power? All I can say is, I hope not, and I pray not. Ramadan greetings to all the Muslims who are watching. May God bless your fast if you are one of those fasting. I need to go now. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but I am continuing this now in what we call after hours. If you want to join me, you can head to Patreon now. That's patreon.com/George Galloway. There it is on the screen. That's where I, as it were, kick back, sip my tea and chew my gum while I'm talking to you. And perhaps most importantly, there'll be a split screen. So you can phone me on Patreon and be in the show with me. We'll have that for everybody next week. But the system isn't yet up and running to take calls on this show. But next Wednesday, the Galloway Show on YouTube, entirely free, will have a phone-in facility in which you can join in, not just in writing as you've been doing in Profusion, but actually be on screen so we can see each other and everyone can see our discussion, our Q&A. Thanks very much for joining me. Please spread the word about this raw and unvarnished Galloway Show on Wednesday evenings at 10 p.m. London time. But above all, please support the mother of all talk shows. It has an audience of over 1 million every week now. We mustn't let it go to the wall. And you can watch it and get your friends to watch it every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. on all platforms, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Twitch, on Telegram, many, many platforms. Please support the mother of all talk shows. The PayPal details are available there, I think. And on Sunday, we'll have one or two other ways that you can support it. I'm looking for a sponsor for the mother of all talk shows. If you are a business person who could be the sponsor, you can have your logo on the screen throughout 3 hours of programming going to more than 1 million people. Very cheaply indeed, very, very cheaply indeed. The cheapest advertising you could ever find for an audience of that size. Thank you very much for joining me and for your continuing interest in what I've got to say. I'm going to Patreon now, kick off my shoes and maybe even take off my jacket. But thanks very much to the viewers of the Galloway Show.